again, and welcome to the future of. Today's episode will be the future of disinformation. I'm your host, Jonathon Narvey. I am here with John Gray, a friend of many years and the founder of Mentionmapp, and these days a man who is very much involved with investigating and researching the disinformation that is spreading all over the internet by synthetic and human means alike. We're going to get into this very much in depth. But before we do, I want John to, if you could introduce yourself a little bit and give people a fuller understanding of your background so that we can get into these topics.
So we can do the deep dive. Thanks, Jonathan. Always good to see you, and thanks for inviting me in for the future of disinformation today. Usually I preface this moment of every conversation. You remember that old Grateful Dead song, Truckin'? Well, I pull the line out of there. Thank you, Jerry Garcia, but what a long, strange trip it's been. That's really how I'm here. We could trace way back to the unique childhood of many books and a world of analog. But usually I put it, Jonathan, I think it's really been driven by this real overriding sense of curiosity. I sort of partly jokingly say that when I started my communications degree at SFU in the olden days, Marshall McLuhan was still alive. And when I finished, Neil Postman had written Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I sort of frame a lot of how I look at today through, going that far back in the communications theory universe. I guess how I got here today was really this, ultimately 10 years ago, diving in, and, the Mentionmapp's been a really key part of getting me here.
So talk about Mentionmapp a little bit.
Yeah, look, I think what's fair to say, we built 10 years ago one of the first ever, network visualization tools on top of Twitter's API. So it looked cool. It was a very sexy, I should say it is a very sexy app. And, it's a great way to look at Twitter, like who's talking to who's talking about what. But ultimately, it was that journey of going, trying to monetize sort of a niche tool, a complex tool. It's been a humbling experience. And I won't blame it all on the 2016 U.S. election campaign. There were a number of things going on, even in the world that I was occupied in at that time. But I said to my co-founder, Travis, I said, it just seems like there's some things going on. Let's see what happens if we plug this bot detection algorithm into our network visualization tool. Well, the week before the inauguration, 2017, is when I ceased ever looking at Twitter the same again. Every hashtag, almost every, and this isn't hyperbole, it was just like everything I was looking at, I was go, could I find something that doesn't have some somewhat suspicious activity connected to the conversation? And really it went from there. 2017, I was fortunate enough, I went to MIT for the first Misinfocon, a pretty intimate gathering of barely 100 people, journalists, and just a variety of people from civil society. And needless to say, in February 2017, people were still getting over the reality that this really unique thing, and I'm using unique loosely, the result of the U.S. election, we had Brexit, we have all these things unfolding, and there's so many questions, and that's really where this really got started, Jonathan, was this looking at behavior on Twitter and using the tool we had to better understand some of the shenanigans were starting to unfold around conversations in the digital space.
Well, I couldn't have asked for the greater introduction. And now we can really get into our topic, which was sparked sort of last week when we both attended, and you were speaking at an event called Democracy and Disinformation, or it might have been reversed. And in attendance, we had a number of students and activists, and actually, I can't really speak to the audience necessarily who they were, but certainly on stage there was yourself. There was a university professor from, I believe, UBC,
Kristanov.
Yeah, and his specialty was something in media communications, or and who else? We
had Lindsay Sample from the Discourse,
right,
as coming at this from very much a journalist perspective, a working journalist perspective.
Right. And the thrust of the conversation on stage and actually beyond the stage was, how to deal with harmful speech and what is harmful speech and how it's having an impact. So I think probably we should create some definitions here before we go too far down this rabbit hole of what is it that we're talking about? What are the problems that we're actually dealing with? Yeah. And so, sort of from a bigger scale down to specific examples like Russia or China, we can say that. Well, actually, I'll let you speak to how do we define the problem and define our terms here.
So. It's still really evolving, and that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be in the position I'm in. To say that I felt like I've spent 3 years at times is this really sort of, that lost voice in the wilderness, or at times thinking like, am I crazy? Does anybody really care? Sorry. Edit that part out. So I think we have to start with the acknowledgement that, and I try not to engage in really hyperbole around this. I left my tinfoil hat at home, I promise. The complexity of the issue.
So, and the issue being?
The issue being is... So we can use we can say misinformation, disinformation, but let's look at the online ecosystem. Let's talk about, in essence, the toxicity that's connected to manipulation and amplification of content, of information, that sort of our core perspective on this is, instead of getting bogged down into the specific definition of misinformation, disinformation, because like I say, it's evolving. The group I'm involved with, the Credibility Coalition, I'm involved with the Misinfosec working group. We look at it really from the essence of misinformation incidents, misinformation campaigns, and we're looking at it through the lens of the intent and the intent to do harm.
What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Well, again, we're still working through that, and some of the people that have originally sort of looked at the matrix, so I look at Claire Wardell over at First Draft News. Even Claire's been an early, very involved in this space. Ben Nimmo over at the Digital Forensic Lab, one of the leaders in the space. So really, what it came down to is talking about disinformation as being intentional.
That's actually fair and easy to understand.
Exactly. But sometimes our challenge, and this is where we've worked through as a working group, is defining intentionality. So we are looking at with another layer, and that's really is understanding when there is activity with intention with harm attached.
Right. Let's look at I'm sure you want to get into the statistics of this because you've done some research, but maybe I wanted to kick off with a specific example of you remember in the towards the last days of the 2016 U.S. campaign, you had I'm a bit fuzzy on the details, but I think it was Facebook ads that. Or it might have been maybe in some internet forum where there were accusations that Clinton's campaign was essentially running a child sex ring out of the basement of a pizza parlor.
Pizzagate.
Yeah. And actually, you remember the details of this?
I do. And so we chalk that up as an incident, versus a campaign. So a misinformation campaign is something that's ongoing, whereas Pizzagate was just one incident as part of a larger campaign. And I think, part of me goes is that we're still so hooked into 2016. And one of the challenges is that we're actually now halfway through 2019. We actually really have to go, hey, 2016, that ship has sailed. I'm continuing to go down that rabbit hole, continuing to go down to make so much of the conversation we're still having today about Russia, about bots. A lot of great stuff has come out of the Mueller investigation. I think what we have to do is we've got to evolve the conversation forward, because guess what? 2016, our adversaries, and by our adversaries, I'm referring to authoritarian, closed society states that are actively involved in a zero-sum game of eroding the institutions and our trust in our institutions and liberal democratic values.
Maybe you could provide a bit of historical context here, because this is obviously not the first kick at the can for these regimes. We're talking Russia, China, other state actors and non-state actors. This is, it's been going on since the dawn of time. Yeah. We have new tools.
And I think that's the key thing, Jonathan, is that, I wanted to say is, like, for me, is that part of this is the complexity of what we're dealing with. And this is where I was going, where I didn't want to get into too much hyperbole, but I think outside of thinking about how we're going to manage our changing climate, I think how we look at trying to tackle some currently incurable diseases. I do believe right now the cancer and the toxicity of what's going on in our digital ecosystem is one of the biggest existential crises that we do have. And again, tinfoil hat left at home. I've been talking a lot lately is that, we talk about cybersecurity. We talk about the importance of securing our networks, securing our data, securing our devices. What we're not talking about is cognitive security. What's actually really happening is it's our brains that are being hacked. We're not talking about the role that we need to elevate into this conversation of some talented people in the cognitive science space. And I think this is the evolution of what we have to really start moving the conversation to, is not automated, not bots, not just the platforms. We actually have to start, I think, acknowledging how messaging, how outrage, how doubt, how our brains are being manipulated. We have to look at this through a sense of, what are all the different bias of work? Confirmation bias. That in itself, I've seen a fair amount of work on one side talking about how citizens, need to start dealing with this. But it's one thing to say, here's the information and here's the misinformation. Here's what you need to start knowing about it. But if we can't overcome our own confirmation bias, then what are some of the solutions? If we can't,
just before we get a little bit further, and we should probably define that confirmation bias.
Well, buying into that which you agree with. So if everything I read resonates and is agreeable, I'm less likely to take potential facts that might actually undermine my well-entrenched position. So if all I'm doing is reading things that are agreeable and supporting my position, it's difficult for us to start having conversations about possibly persuading people that there's another perspective or point of view, or presenting facts to suggest that their belief that vaccinating their children is not a good idea. Sure. But what I wanted to roll back is that you touched on a really important thing, is that this is not new. I love to point out the example in 44 BC how Octavius printed a coin that had Mark Antony's head on one side and Cleopatra's on the other, and he distributed those coins in the Senate. And it actually successfully illustrated a disinformation campaign that Mark Antony and Cleopatra are out to divide the empire. And it helped successfully elevate Octavius eventually to become Augustus Caesar. That was 44 BC. Let's fast forward now to 2016, 17, 18, and today. What we have is obviously tools at our disposal. So we have a way different, supply and demand ratio of content and consumption. But the biggest thing that I think is fueling the challenges in this space is that now we have these tools of the ability to test our content rapidly, A/B test it, create feedback loops. We've got numerous forms in which we can inject memes, we can inject fake forged documents, we can essentially bore right out of today's marketers' playbook, test, find out what's working, and keep iterating through our messaging, and then take advantage of micro-targeting.
I think, one...
At scale.
One thing that happened a few years ago, actually I guess maybe it's more than 10 years ago, the search engines started taking into account your previous searches and thereby moderating your searches to only show you things that are more akin to things you had already searched. And, so we're developing these silos of information, and maybe I'm more cognizant of it just because I remember that time before where you would plug in a search term and it would just give you, everyone got the same results.
Yeah.
And maybe, there were biases attached to that approach as well, I suppose. But nowadays it's hard to get out of our bubbles. We're more divided than ever. I mean, that's almost cliche to say at this point. I think, how do you recommend that people get out of those bubbles and maybe test their biases?
I start putting this thing sometimes is that there's a percentage of the population that are avid consumers of information, that have a degree of education, have a degree of professionalism, and in terms of careers, in terms of what they do. I think at times is that where we're failing in this conversation, and I'll get to that. But one of my beefs is that we're not talking enough about what we need to do collectively as a society to elevate overall literacy. We get these really powerful devices, thank you Apple and such, that have more computing power today than what landed Neil Armstrong and the crew of Apollo 11 on the moon. But yet we don't get a little handbook to say, hey, you've got this tool. And it can play a very significant role, as we know mobile these days does. Is there a recommendation to maybe turn off some of those alerts that you're getting on your phone? So we think about how our brains are going, oh, look at this headline. Oh, how is our worldview, in some cases, being dictated simply by headlines that are coming from not the actual source? But I'm sorry, we don't get our news from Facebook.
Well, a lot of people think they do.
Exactly, but the trouble is it is coming from Facebook, but that's not the source. So if we don't know the difference from a headline that I've just maybe clicked through that's from Breitbart versus the New York Times.
Well, and this gets into cognitive bias as well on a deeper level. Like you've got, let's say, you see a fact that or you see a headline you disagree with, and you disagree with it on a gut level. You don't know yet that it's wrong, actually. And so you start going to motive. You start going to source. And that's, these are the tools of a skeptic. But, let's say you trust the New York Times implicitly, and they have gotten stories wrong.
Yes.
I mean, the whole Russiagate thing, for 2 years, they promoted the conspiracy theory that probably significant numbers of the population, both in the U.S. and Canada, probably still think, I'm guessing a third, possibly up to nearly half of Americans think that the American president was some kind of Manchurian candidate, knowingly in league with Vladimir Putin, and for 2 years this was spread. So it's the disinformation doesn't just happen through social channels, and yeah. So I'm curious. Actually, I had a question connected to this leading up to our conversation, which is, let's say you have the case of 10,000 bots, and they're putting out information that is perfectly true. So let's say in the upcoming Canadian election, you have 10,000 bots putting out funny memes and images of Trudeau on his laughable India tour, and they're all putting out images that have not been photoshopped. They're just clips from the media, or it's just or you could do the same thing on the conservative side. You could do the same thing, Democrat, Republican. It doesn't matter. You can put out these embarrassing images or criticism that are perfectly valid, but it's from robots. So what?
So if it's so my issue is yes. Look, we've had some great through the years. I mean, think about political satire, cartoonists. I mean, none of this is really new. So yeah, and that was one of my points I was talking about. Is literacy is the power of memes, mimetic warfare. But that aside, is yes, if a political figure serves up easy to make fun of, easy to satirize, in essence, Saturday Night Live yourself, that's one thing. But my issue is that when we start deploying synthetic behavior that's anonymous, that's programmatic, that's not transparent, doing it at volume, that's where I think we start falling into an area of you really have to question the motive, the intent behind doing it. So it's a coordinated attack. It's a coordinated activity. It's non-human, and it's not transparent. It's not being done transparently. And the other thing that's very successful behind that is it's not just also the amplification, but it's those very engagement metrics. So suddenly a bunch of essentially non-human retweets, a bunch of non-human likes, potentially even using a chatbot-like technology to put in a pithy reply. But the key thing is that's manipulating the algorithm as well, because the algorithm is dialing into engagement metrics. Thus, now that content's getting pushed further up into people's feeds now. So my issue is firmly, look, I don't care what side of the fence you are politically. If you're using those kinds of techniques and tactics, that's just adding more cover to the bigger problem, and that's the problem of our actual real adversaries, state actors and their proxies. And it's contributing to, I believe, the toxicity of what's going on online.
So for those who maybe are a bit skeptical and think, you know what, it doesn't matter what happens on Twitter and Facebook. I live in the real world. Maybe we can talk about some real-world impacts of misinformation or more disinformation campaigns conducted online, via bots or humans, and so you. Well,
I think part of it, we've got to start looking at some of this beyond simply one incident, right? Like Pizzagate, that was an incident. If we look at these behaviors, these activities happening over time, happening across multiple platforms. So we've seen, for instance, the DFR Lab just put out a very recent and great bit of investigation around a fake document that was distributed through 6 different languages, through Medium, through a variety of different websites. It was a
By the
really
way,
unique.
Our listeners can't really see your air quotes. So
no, yes, sorry. I know they can't, but it's my way of thinking to myself. That's part of the challenge here, Jonathan. Is the complexities. We have so many, in essence, different attack surfaces by which different content can be distributed, and done so, like I say, at scale, done so anonymously, and this isn't just about Facebook. This just isn't about Twitter. Hey, turn off your autoplay on YouTube, for instance. Pick a platform. I think I could actually also address, you were talking about earlier about search engines. I don't have the exact science by which potentially some of our adversaries are operating, very sophisticated black hat SEO that are manipulating results. So, for instance, I get a couple of Google News alerts per day. So that's coming right into my inbox. That's sort of customized for me. Imagine weekly, I won't say daily because that's over the top, but at least once a week I get at least one headline into one of my email news alerts that if I didn't stop and actually get beyond the headline to actually look what the source was, I'd be firmly reading an article from Sputnik or from RT, Russia Today. And I ask myself, how is that getting into my email newsletter? I don't have the answer, but it is, and that takes some effort to manipulate the search algorithm.
So we've been talking about how things can go wrong. Let's look forward. Talk to me about the nightmare scenario, say, because you wanted to talk about what could be happening in 2020 or even beyond. We could talk about the U.S. election that's upcoming, or go wherever
Well, I
you
think
want.
part of it is that we should always be having conversations beyond simply elections. This is not an issue that's just simply about elections. Obviously we have our own coming up in October that I will be doing some more, shall we say, looking into. Then of course we're well on our way to the 2020. So there's no shortage of elections, and this is global too. Let's get over ourselves. This isn't just about Canada. This isn't just about U.S. There's obviously going to be probably another election in the UK coming up, but we also again have to look at, for instance, behaviors that have been reported that came out of the Brazilian elections. There's been these behaviors happening in Mexico that we can go back. I can find examples of some very sophisticated work going back as far as like 2011, 2012. So what's really interesting is, again, none of this is new, but it just seems like for it to really get sort of into our conscious, collective conscious now, is it took the election of Donald Trump to start really elevating this conversation of that, hey, our digital ecosystem isn't just one of rainbows and unicorns. Somewhere along the way, some people forgot there's folks with bad intent out there too. There's trolls under the bridge.
So I want to push back on that a little bit, I think we actually agree for the most part with about what I'm going to say, but you can feel free to disagree.
Absolutely.
Oh, we just got our 10-minute
Whoa.
flag, so we got about we have a few minutes to wrap this up.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to be
How
quick.
time flies when you're having fun.
So one thing that came up in the event a week ago was there seemed to be an assumption amongst many of the audience members, and certainly amongst certain members of the the speakers on stage, that already we pointed to the election of Donald Trump, we pointed to Brexit, we pointed to Brazil, and there's an assumption that online shenanigans have swayed these crucial elections in some fundamental way. And I think we maybe don't have enough data to say either way. I'd like to make the case that, for now, it seems to be somewhat early days where we don't know that the impact was that crazy. I'd like to make the case that maybe in the U.S., Trump won because Clinton was a terrible candidate. Brexit happened because the people were simply upset with levels of immigration and impacts on the UK's culture and all of these things. And there's this very smug kind of attitude amongst a lot of people, it seems to me, where it's like, oh, the politics is going in the wrong way because idiots were manipulated.
Yeah.
So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, so I do agree. Like, I have a big issue of the impact statements. We don't have enough data. I don't know if we've asked the right questions, and so I don't, in terms of my research and how I look at this, I'm very skeptical every time I read something where there's claims of impact attached. I'm always interested myself in looking at what intentional behaviors are going on. And so my thing is that, again, I'm looking at this from a long game. These types of behaviors and this type of activity has been happening way before Brexit, way before the U.S. election. One could argue a lot of Ukraine is Russia's personal little test bed for a lot of this stuff. So go back to 2014. So I'm with you. I'm very leery about assigning the impact and drawing that direct cause correlation that because this happened, this is the outcome. One of my other things, though, that I think sometimes is that we think so much in this conversation about getting somebody to vote a particular way. One of my things that I like to put out there, just being the contrarian in me and moving towards the great wrap-up we're going to have, is what about a way to manipulate the narratives to get people not to do something? One of my great concerns are elements of voter suppression, misleading the electorate, when to vote, how to vote, if you can vote, and why to vote at all. And so if part of the grand zero-sum game of our adversaries, and I'm very clear, I'm talking about adversaries that are authoritarian nations that do not have a vested interest in the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of movement, the freedom to gather. If it is about eroding the very values, our imperfect liberal democracy, eroding the trust in our institutions, then convincing us that they're not worth voting for is a pretty good tactic too.
On that note, we're going to have to wrap up. It's been a pleasure. Thanks. I've been talking with John Gray about the future of disinformation. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.